Okay, so good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrea Morales. I'm a fourth year majoring in international studies. I am an intern at the Latinx Resource Center. My position here is Indigenous Communities Program Intern. And through this position, I am working towards creating awareness of Indigenous communities throughout the Latin America diaspora, while also creating programming that supports Indigenous and Native students here on campus. So in celebration of Mes de la Mujer, I think it's important that we recognize Indigenous women in higher education, throughout academia and research. So for that, I have invited Dr. Gutierrez here to share with us a little bit about her work and her experiences as an undergrad. So Dr. Gutierrez, thank you for joining us today, and please take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Andrea, Adeli, Victoria, everyone at the UCI Latinx Resource Center for inviting me to this event, and also to celebrate, but also to talk about the issues that as Indigenous women we face in academia. So I'm going to be sharing my experience this afternoon. I'm going to share my screen, so please let me know if you're able to see it or not. I have some slides that I would like to show you. Okay. So my name is Maria Gutierrez de Jesus. I am currently a postdoc fellow at the University of Minnesota in Twin Cities in the Department of Organizational Leadership, Policy, and Development in the College of Education and Human Development. And I wanted to start this presentation here with a picture of my mom. And that is me, or at least that's what I think. I have a twin sister, so sometimes it's very difficult to tell who is who in the pictures. But this is my mother right here. She was a teacher in Michoacán for about 30 years. So I wanted to have her here in the first image to also commemorate her work as a teacher, as an educator, and also because she inspired me to do the work that I do and to be in education. So I wanted to start off by showing this image. This is an outline that I have because I just wanted to keep us a little bit more organized throughout this presentation, and also to observe the time that we have this evening to talk about the things that I want to share. So I'm going to start by talking about my personal background, about the work that I do. I'm going to introduce the Purepecha people, so in case you are not familiar with the Purepecha culture. And also, I'm going to walk you through the different stages of my academic background. And I want to say that my reflections and in this presentation do not only come from my higher education journey, but also stem from my role as a community member and as a collaborator in a community radio project back in my community of origin in Michoacán. My academic work is deeply embedded in who I am, where I come from, and what I envision as a professional in academia, but also as a community member, as a Purepecha woman. So for the second half of the presentation, I'm going to share some reflections about Indigenous women in academia, about the environments that make it harder for Indigenous women to navigate academic spaces, but also about the importance of our identity as a tool of resilience and strength. And in particular, regarding my own identity and my work as an academic, I will focus on two things specifically: Indigenous women, in my case, Purepecha women, as creators of knowledge, and about the importance of maintaining my identity in the diaspora in an academic institution. So to give you a little bit of context, so this is a map of Lake Pátzcuaro. And I also want to show you some images about the community that I've placed in some of the slides of this presentation. I come from a Purepecha community of Michoacán, Mexico, called Huecorio. And you can see at the bottom of the image of the map, it says Pátzcuaro. There is a red dot, and close to that is Huecorio. I was born in Michoacan. I was raised in Michoacan and attended kindergarten all the way through ninth grade in Mexico. And I came to the US as a first generation migrant and also started ninth grade in a high school in North Highlands, California, in the Sacramento County. So since then, I have lived in Sacramento and lately between Michoacan and California. And I also have a twin sister who also has a PhD. So both of us are the first generation PhDs in our family. So when I was preparing today's presentation, I went back all the way to my high school experience in the US, and I thought about how all those years, about the cultural clash that I went through, the linguistic barriers that I faced and that my family also has faced, the educational barriers as first generation migrant, as a first generation Indigenous woman in higher education. And however, I also came to realize that the Purepecha people are not unfamiliar to this. Historically, the relationship between the Purepecha communities of Michoacan and the Mexican government in education has been one of assimilation and Spanish language acquisition at the expense the genocide of indigenous languages and cultures. Many families and communities are not unfamiliar with stories about historical and intergenerational trauma due to the assimilationist policies of the Mexican state. In the US, perhaps some of you are familiar with the cultural and linguistic genocide that Native American tribes have gone through as a result of boarding schools that were established since the 19th century all the way through the 20th century, which resulted in the forced removal of Native children into boarding schools far away from their communities and their families. And in the case of Mexico, for example, in recent decades, intercultural education projects have focused on incorporating indigenous languages and cultural knowledge into the classrooms. And this has led to many discussions about how effective these have actually been. And I won't necessarily discuss these projects and debates in this presentation, but I mention it because these are examples of what the Purepecha people and indigenous people in different contexts and geographical spaces have experienced when it comes to state education, and also because as indigenous migrant women, this experience adds to our lack of access to education, especially to higher education, how this lack of access has historically reproduced. And I also want to highlight that Indigenous women are also creating spaces for other Indigenous students and other Indigenous women in faculty positions and in other roles in universities. So I also want to mention that collaborative and community engaged work is central to the work that I do as a Purepecha scholar, whether it is through my research or teaching. I work primarily on issues of Indigenous education, community-based pedagogies, language and cultural revival, and community-owned media. And I'm going to be sharing some of that throughout this presentation. And the context in my community of origin has also informed extensively the work that I do, whether in academic spaces, in my community as well, and why I do it. So I am Purepecha. I come from a community where the language no longer spoken, and only a handful of elders in my community remember when the language was still spoken. When I started collaborating with Indigenous media projects, especially radio back in 2017, as part of the radio team, we wanted to ask questions about the Purepecha language in the community and about the history that led to language annihilation in my community. And at the same time, there were Purepecha speaking communities in ancestral territory where the radio has been a space to communicate in the language, but also a space for language revitalization. So there were also other emerging radios in communities where Purepecha has been losing vitality to Spanish, or in communities where it's no longer spoken, like mine, for example, and where the radio teams have been also working towards reclaiming the language through the radio. So this is how my involvement in community media emerged. So in my work with the radio and also in other academic and community-based projects, I draw on community engaged research, oral histories, interviews, archival research, and also from indigenous and Purepecha-based epistemology or worldview, which I frame from specific elements that are still present in my community, such as reciprocity, Haruak Perakwa in the Purepecha language, Maruats Perakwa, which is community service, Hakakukwa, which is our belief system, Antekoret, which is our collective work, and Ses Irekan, which is the good living. So who are the Purepecha people? So to give you a very brief context, the Purepecha people are one of the largest indigenous ethnic groups in Mexico and have roughly about 140,000 speakers of the Purepecha language. The ancestral territory of the Purepecha is located in central Michoacán, and there's also a significant population in the US, in the diaspora, in states such as California and Washington, North Carolina, Illinois, which are some of the states that have the largest number of Purepecha migrants. And one note that I wanted to add to the presentation is that the Mexican government uses language as a principal marker of indigenous identity. And the census only counts people 5 years and older who say that they speak indigenous language. What the census, for example, does not take into account are people who do not say that they speak Purepecha due to discrimination and racism, or people who reside outside of Mexico, and people who identify as Purepecha but who do not speak it. And this also may apply to people who have knowledge of the language but who are not fluent, as well as those who do not speak it at all. The Purepecha region is also divided into 4 regions, Pucumio, which is the highlands region, Erashaman, which is the 11 towns region, Zacapendio, which is the Zacapu marshlands region, and Japundaro, which is the lake area. And my community, Huecorio, is located in the latter, in the Lake Pátzcuaro region. And according to official statistics, Mexico has about 68 indigenous languages and 364 linguistic variants or dialects. And despite that the Purepecha language is not necessarily considered in imminent danger of extinction, the Purepecha language has lost vitality to Spanish in many contexts, in many communities. And within the last years, and as a result of recent ethnic reivindication processes, indigenous peoples, and in this case, the Purepecha people included, have placed the language at the core of ethnic reivindication, indigenous autonomy, and self-determination processes, and decolonization practices. And many of the workbooks to learn Purepecha have come from Purepechas in academic spaces or in other educational spaces in institutions, in addition to providing Purepecha language courses for Purepecha college students, for the general public, and for the communities. So these are just some images of my community. Huecorio is a small community located on the shores of Lake Pátzcuaro in central Michoacán. It is a community of less than 1,000 people. Some people in the community say that Huecorio, that about 50% or more of a community's original residents do not actually reside in the community, but outside of it, and mostly in the US. Also, there are smaller communities of people from Huecorio in cities like Morelia, which is Michoacán state capital, or other cities like Monterrey, or Guadalajara. When it comes to the US, people from Huecorio usually come to California. They also go to Nevada, and to a lesser extent to other states, such as Texas. And at some point, there was a lot of people from Huecorio migrating and living in Texas that people refer to Huecorio as Huecorio, Texas, which is something that is, some people still refer to the community as such. So Huecorio, like many other indigenous communities of central Mexico and Michoacán, has a long history of migration. And the colonial disruption that the Lake Pátzcuaro region was subject to, it led to the displacement of entire communities. People were forced not only to work in haciendas established in the region by Spanish hacendados, but also to migrate to other places for work. Michoacán's Tierra Caliente region was a primary place where the people from Huecorio left for work, and also forced labor continued even after Mexico's independence from Spain. And in the 20th century, people from Huecorio also left to the US as part of the Bracero program. Some families established permanently in the US and some others returned to that community. So migration takes place when people, for example, either communities to study. It is common for Purepecha youth in the communities to leave their communities to continue with their education. Students, for example, who have graduated from high school and enroll in higher education institutions usually leave for Morelia, Zamora, Uruapan, and other cities in Michoacan to complete their BA or their BS degrees. And also for Purépechas in graduate programs, Morelia, Mexico City, and Guadalajara are popular destinations to enroll in academic programs. And but today it is difficult to talk about the historical and contemporary context of my community without talking about migration. And my family as a migrant family is part of this context. And like in my case, there are also those of us who have entered higher education programs in the US. So through my experience in community radio, as part of a mostly Indigenous women's collective, I have thought a lot about how community creates and transmits knowledge. Huecorio is a community that, like other Purepecha communities, is organized around the cargo system. Cargos are socio-religious and civil posts where people in the community serve without monetary payment. It's all community service, and it's part of a community's forms of an organization. Huecorio has over 100 individual cargos that must renew every single year. And within the cargo system structure, all members of the community, women, children, youth, elders, have specific roles. And so community members, through these specific roles, contribute to the community's organization, the festivities, and other things that go on in the community. So all this is part of our traditional knowledge and education system in Huecorio, and through our participation in the community, we learn and are integrated into the community. And in particular, I have been reflecting on how knowledge creation and transmission looks like for Indigenous women, especially for Purepecha women. And I would like to make a parenthesis here and say that these ideas do not necessarily run across all Indigenous communities or all Indigenous women, or even all Purepecha communities and all Purepecha women, because we face multiple issues and have diverse lived experiences. And I think it is important to also acknowledge that. And I have also been thinking about my journey in Western education, because I must also acknowledge, as Maori scholar and educator Linda Tuhiwai-Smith says, how Western academia is inherently colonial and has historically devalued non-Western knowledge systems and Indigenous voices. Historically, academia has emphasized individualism over collective knowledge and practice, deeming those who work in community-based and also in community-engaged projects as, for example, quote unquote, less serious than other fields and other disciplines and other theories and methodologies. And traditional knowledge production in Western universities cannot only be seen through very rigid research methodologies that don't accept other ways of engaging with our own communities. And but although I have to say that these may vary in some disciplines that have developed and even encourage other ways of knowledge production and sharing, like Linda Tuhiwai-Smith says. But also when we write about our work as academics, we, as Native academics especially, we may be questioned by certain sectors of the academy when we show our personality, because we may not be seen as objective. So that's why I think that centralizing our voices intentionally as Indigenous women in academia through what we write, teach, and so on is so important, because it allows us to transgress academic spaces and engage with other forms of knowledge as creators, as producers, as transmitters, and facilitators of knowledge. So I'm going to go ahead and a little bit about my academic background. So I would like to share briefly with you each stage of my education journey. And I wanted to include and start out with my high school experience, because it truly shaped my approach to higher education, especially my teaching, and it informed how I see academia today. And then I will share a little bit more about my undergraduate and graduate journeys, as well as my post-PhD journey, and what my identity has meant to me during my higher education journey as an Indigenous woman. So I'm going to start out with my high school experience. So I started ninth grade about after a month having migrated to the US with my sister and my mom to reunite with my father, who had been in the US for decades. And I didn't know a word of English, and the thought of attending a new school with no friends in a city that was so unfamiliar with a language that I didn't understand at all was deeply terrifying. So when I look back to my education journey, and as someone who always liked and enjoyed going to school when I was living in Michoacan, growing up, and someone who still does school, I have to say truly the high school has been one of my least favorite experiences in education. And for the first time in my short lifetime, I was 14 years old. I did not like going to school. And I always found myself counting the days for the next holiday or the next vacation, so I didn't have to go. So through my high school journey, I have to say that I felt alone many, many times, and that cultural clash and the language barriers were just too much to handle at some point. And I remember listening to stories of friends and family members who had migrated and mentioned that they mentioned how fast I was going to learn English, how fast I was going to get used to living in the US. And when I was in junior high in Mexico, I remember some of my friends and former friends left for the US, but there were also some fellow classmates who returned back to Michoacan, and some of them were saying how much they liked school here in the US, and also heard about stories about people who said that I was going to learn fast because I was younger, and the younger that you are, the faster that you can absorb knowledge, and especially language. But the thing is, I migrated when I was 14, and I did not learn fast. And so some of my classmates did, but I didn't. So what I learned through these is that every experience is unique. So in high school, I was placed in an ESL program, which is English as a Second Language. And I was in that program for 2.5 years. And at the time in my high school, at least for the time that I was a student there up until graduation, most of the students in my ESL program remained there for an average of 2 years, more or less. And then we transitioned into what the school called regular classes. And when I transitioned into regular classes during my junior year, I was so scared. And the first class that I attended was an English course, and we had to write a lot in that class because it was a writing class. And I felt out of place with a lot of insecurities because I felt that I was not going to be successful. But my teacher in that class was an amazing teacher, very understanding of the situation. And I had a similar experience in other classes, I have to say. But I want to mention this particular class as an example because it was the first class that I attended right after my counselor had changed my schedule to leave the ESL program. And I also remember during my senior year, the time when high school students are taking exams and thinking about their future plans, applying to university programs and so on. And I remember that I was so surprised because I had no idea what the SATs were, what the exams were. In my plans, attending college was always part of the plan ever since growing up. And I think it also has to do a lot because of my mother, because she was a teacher. And my desire to be in any way involved in teaching and education comes from her. So she is now retired. She worked as a rural teacher for about 30 years in various towns of central Michoacan. So she is from Hueporio. She was born and raised in the community. And after completing 9th grade in the nearby town of Pátzcuaro, since my community didn't have a junior high at the time, she enrolled in a teacher training institution which is called Escuela Normal in Mexico, to become an elementary school teacher. So she attended Escuela Normal Jesus Romero Flores in the city of Morelia. And while she studied, she also started working as a teacher in Huecorio. And then she was moved to other towns across central Michoacan. So her dedication to her students along those 30 years, and also her activism in the teachers movement in Michoacan, shown me the importance of working to transform education. That is one of the things that I wanted to do. But so knowing that I wanted to go to college right after high school, it came as a shock that I and many of my classmates from the ESL program had no idea what those exams were. And we never had a university tour or attended any talks about university or career choices while in an ESL program. But I also found out that these programs were offered to students who were in regular classes, but we didn't get those. So I asked about the exams. I learned about what they were. And that high school students had to take them in order to apply to university programs. So close to graduation, I did some more research, and I decided to enroll in a community college. So I have to say that attending a community college has also been one of the most rewarding and meaningful experiences I had. And I'm sure that it paved the way for my success in higher education. So as a former transfer student to the University of California, I appreciate the opportunities that community colleges offer to students who share similar experiences to mine. In Sacramento, I attended American River College. I was at American River College for about 2 years prior to transferring to UC Davis. And at ARC, I want to highlight that the Puente program. I was part of it. It is a Hispanic serving program designed to advise students from low-income communities to navigate higher education. And being in Puente helped me a lot to understand the transferring process, to obtain help about financial assistance, which was totally unfamiliar to me, as well as to relate to other Latina students, to other Indigenous students who were in community college, who were also first generation students and who didn't know how to navigate the higher education system like myself. Then I transferred to UC Davis to complete my BA degree in political science and Native American studies. I transferred only as a political science major, but my major interest was in Native American studies, which started also in community college. And these interests was also reinforced by the courses that I took in the program. Eventually, I took enough courses to pre-consider NAS and as a double major, and that's what I did. And one of the reasons that I found my niche at the NAS program at UC Davis, I think it was its focus. NAS at UC Davis has a hemispheric focus, and the faculty that was there at the time and that's still part of the program also emphasize on and work with Indigenous communities of Mexico, Central and South America. And my BA journey at UC Davis really allowed me to reflect on what I wanted to do afterwards. And I can say that NAS had a lot to do with it. So, Indigenous women in higher education are severely underrepresented and underserved. And this exacerbates for Indigenous women in graduate programs. So, but I wanted to go to grad school, and as I mentioned, this was a decision that was also fueled because of my experience as an undergrad in Native American Studies, and because I was also working with Indigenous women who were in faculty positions in academia. So, what were the factors that led me to pursue a PhD degree? And when I think about this question, it is, I think it is easy, but also complex at the same time. Getting a PhD does not necessarily mean that you want to pursue an academic career or that you should. That people get PhD degrees for various reasons. My decision to pursue a PhD And to be interested for now in an academic career has been fueled by two elements that I can say I received from my former Indigenous professors, which are community engaged work and meaningful teaching in higher education. I also have a degree in political science. I remember enjoying my classes in the poli-sci program, both at American River College and UC Davis, but I got to my NAS program at UC Davis. I was even more interested in the intersections between Indigenous studies and law. And in the beginning of my BA, right before my PhD, my tentative plan was to finish up my BA, perhaps get some work experience, and then apply to law schools. And I took this plan very seriously, that I got a bunch of LSAT study books at the UC Davis bookstore and started going through the books every time I get a chance between my classes and my work at retail. At the time, I was also looking up for information on prep courses that could help me strengthen my knowledge and skills for the time that I applied to law school programs. I remember that I even went ahead and took a formal LSAT practice test. But towards the end, I went and applied to a PhD because I realized that for what I wanted to do and how I envisioned myself, a PhD was a better option, and went ahead and applied to the program. So what are some of the things that worked for me and what didn't? This is, of course, not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to give you just a couple points for each one about what worked for me and what didn't. I've learned so many things throughout my academic journey, I learned, but I'm also learning about what works for me, what doesn't. And one of the highlights of my academic journey so far has been the advice and also the encouragement of my professors since I started community college all the way to my PhD and postdoctoral journey. And when I have a chance to talk about my higher education journey, I like to acknowledge the mentoring and the teaching that I got to experience from my Indigenous professors. And I know that this was crucial to my decision of pursuing a PhD and an academic career. Through my Indigenous professors, I also learned about the importance of the knowledge that we bring as Indigenous students to academic spaces. And I appreciate this network of support that came from my professors. So that's why I have here mentoring from my professors, surrounding myself also with peers that provided support, not only in regards to academics, but also emotional support to check in with each other, how we were doing, what we thought about grad school, talking about our communities, sharing about the knowledge that we had in our communities and our experiences, and also having the support of my family and my community. So I think that staying connected to my network was extremely, and still is extremely important to me throughout my journey. What are some of the things that didn't work so well? Academia is very draining, and graduate school is no exception. And I felt alone many, many times, and I questioned whether pursuing a graduate program was even worth it. Real expectations of the academic world, not many spaces for Indigenous experiences, not listening to many Indigenous voices, and also funding, which I'm sure many students can relate. Funding for students gets in the way of our success, and for Indigenous and Native students and for graduate education, lack of funding is even more difficult. So this is just a discussion reflection question that I added and that I would like us to think about. You can write it in the chat, or you can just, reflect on it. Think about, name something that you brought with you to higher education that was already part of your knowledge, something that nurtured you, something meaningful to you, something that you see, that you hear, that you think about, where you engage as a creator and transmitter of knowledge, because we all have it prior to coming to academic institutions. Academic institutions are not the only space and the only way to create, produce, transmit knowledge. So we all have it in our communities, in our families. And for my post-PhD journey. My focus is to continue working with Purepecha communities. After I finished my PhD, I realized even more how important it is to me to continue working with our communities. It is important to me to stay connected with my community back in Michoacan and also with the Purepecha community in the US diaspora. Social media has given us the opportunity to do so. I remember being in high school, early 2000s, after I migrated, looking for resources on the internet where I could see what was going on in my community. And my cousins always send me pictures. I talk to family members on the phone, but not being able to live there, to be there, meant for me missing out on so many things. And I wanted to be part of that. And with the rise of social media and with other platforms, I have also felt more connected, and I can also see what's happening, watch videos and so on. So I think this is one of the reasons why being in community media, especially now in my post-PhD journey, and combining it also with the work that I do in academia has meant so much to me. So for part 2, I want to talk a little bit more about Indigenous women in academic spaces. It wouldn't be fair to talk about Indigenous women in academia without speaking about the struggles that Indigenous women face, in particular when it comes to sexism, racism, discrimination. And it is not surprising to see that Indigenous women are highly underrepresented and underserved in higher education institutions, both as students and professors and in other roles. So Indigenous women in academia face multiple issues such as lack of visibility, institutional violence, misrepresentation, historical marginalization, other voices and those of their communities, racism, misidentification, and many other forms of discrimination. So these issues do not only reproduce in US higher education, but also across transnational borders. And this is part of a larger problem that reproduces in other areas of society that harms Indigenous women and their communities. So these issues in academic spaces are a reality, and we cannot move forward if we don't recognize them, and if we don't demand academic institutions to act on that. So for decades, Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women, on the other hand, have worked to create spaces that don't exist for ourselves, for other Indigenous students, for other Indigenous women in faculty positions, for our communities, and also for our knowledges to be in academic institutions. So that's why I think that community engaged work is so important in academia, because first of all, we cannot disconnect academia from the intellectual extractivism that Indigenous communities across the continent have faced and continue to face. If Indigenous peoples are rendered invisible in academia, this lack of visibility increases for Indigenous women. And when I was working on my dissertation, for example, in one of the Purepecha communities that I visited, one of the Purepecha elder women whom I talked to, she was mentioning that she received many visits from researchers, from students, from universities who wanted to talk to her, who wanted to interview her, because she, in the Purepecha Indigenous social movement, she has played a very important role, and people want to know about her, people want to interview her. But she has said that she always acted with caution, and she decided who she wanted to talk to, because as communities, we have gone through the experience of academics coming over to our communities, extracting knowledge, information, and leaving, not to see them again anymore. So there are no contributions to our communities. So she was always very cautious of what she said and to the people that she talked to. And as Indigenous women in academia, it is important also, on the other hand, to contribute back to our communities. So no matter what field we are in, whether you are in academia or not, in the case of Purepecha, for those of us who grew up in a community, we conceptualize community service, which we call Maruatzperakwa, and collective work anchored within the community's internal structures. So earlier in the presentation, I was sharing you about my community's relationship with a cargo system. And taking on a cargo position is community service. It's Maruat Speraqua. And working towards the successful completion of a cargo cannot be done without antecored or collective work. But there are other ways in which we can reciprocate and practice these principles out of away or outside of a cargo system, which if you're familiar with the Purepecha communities or with indigenous communities, these internal structures many times revolve about the church or about socio-religious services. So working in other spaces out of that, or away from that and reciprocate to the community can also serve as a way to practice community service and collective work beyond community settings, especially for those of us who cannot be in that community all the time. So that's how I see the work I do, or that I intend to do in whatever space that I am. Right at this moment, it is from my place in academia, but in the future, it might be from other spaces. So in that case, I think there is a set of questions that I think is worth asking. For example, how can we work with our own communities? How can we contribute from any disciplinary fields that we are in, whether as students, as professors, and so on, to not continuing to perpetuate the historical racism and the intellectual destruction that our communities have gone through? And also, can we see academia as part of the community service? That is, community members, we must reciprocate back to our communities. So in that case, how is knowledge produced in Purepecha communities? So in that regard, I just want to highlight two aspects of it: collectivity and orality. So I would like to go back to the collective element of traditional knowledge for my community, and I want to go back to it because many times we see that the work that we do in academia during our studies tends to be a solitary journey and very individualistic. I was mentioning earlier about my work in a community radio, and this work emerged during my dissertation work. I was living back in the community, strengthening relationships, building new ones. And growing up and during the time of the dissertation that I lived there, I have participated in the community. By participating in the cargos that my family members have had, attending communal assemblies, engaging in celebrations, and so on, I've learned that community practices rely on collective knowledge and collective work. And we need from the collectivity to keep that community going, and women are an important part of it. And for the Purepecha people, the oral tradition has been the way through which our history, our knowledge system, our language, our culture, our music, all aspects of who we are have been transmitted. So regarding community-based education, for example, the oral tradition is also the way in which this is transmitted and reproduced. So the transmission of knowledge in Purepecha communities is founded on orality. And in many cases in the communities that still speak Purepecha, this is done through the Purepecha language. But in other cases, it can also take place in Spanish in communities where the language has lost vitality. So I see these two principles of collectivity and orality as important tenets of how I conceive my work and the type of relationships that I want to engage in with my community. So I want to go back briefly to the importance of Purepecha women in my community. Women play a central role in our communities, in our Purepecha communities, and their participation allows for the continuation of community life. In Purepecha communities, for example, as I was mentioning, that women participate actively in the traditional cargo systems where they have often positions. And these spaces, women organize, convene people, and women have also been opening spaces in local assemblies as well as in civil and communal posts, which have been traditionally been dominated by men. And also indigenous women defend their territories, they defend Mother Earth, their bodies, their voices, and the work that Purepecha women do across spaces is extremely valuable, and that also includes Purepecha women who are in academic spaces. And I have another discussion / reflection question. Just think about or name one element, one thing, one thought, a person, a place, and so on, that is important to you and that you identify as part of your identity. So identity as resilience. So through my higher education journey, I have found strength in my identity as a Purepecha woman. The education system has historically forced Indigenous women to strip of their identity with the idea that we have to do so in order to be successful, that we have to assimilate, that we have to stop speaking our languages or not learning them if we don't speak them anymore, or dressing up in our traditional clothing. Or on the other hand, Indigenous women are also used as tokens where our folklorized presence is as important as any other decoration in academic or touristic events or in other institutional events. When it comes to education, in the beginning of the presentation, I was sharing about how Indigenous boarding schools in the US or Spanish language acquisition programs in state education in Mexico are examples of how Indigenous cross spaces and cultural contexts have been the subjects of genocide. But our identity can also be our strength and part of our resilience in education. And there is a motto of the Zapatistas that says that a world where many worlds fit. And this is very important because it speaks to the need of respecting other voices, other forms of knowledge, other forms of creating that knowledge, and a world where diversity has true meaning beyond academic and institutional discourses. And our culture, our language, our belief system nurture us. They show us that there are other ways to see and to understand the world, from education, spirituality, food, the land, the surroundings, and so much more. And all of these elements are part of our identity. And we find them also in the stories that we listen to in our families and in our communities. And I want to show you some of the images that I included in this presentation from the work that I've done back in the community. So the first photo is on the left is from a photo exhibit that we at the Radio Collective, where I collaborate in my community, organized. So this exhibit is from 2020 and it's called Huecorio en el Tiempo. And it was right before the pandemic hit. And for this exhibit, we collected photos from the Crefal archive, which is Crefal is an institution located in Pátzcuaro that through the 1950s to the 1980s carried out multiple education projects in the late Pátzcuaro region in Black communities, including mine, and left a vast photographic archive. So during our dissertation research, my sister and I had the opportunity to consult these archives and see the photos. And we also asked people from the community to if they wanted to share some of their photos with us for the exhibit, and they agreed. And some of the images that were also part of the exhibit came from our own family archive. So we inaugurated this exhibit in February of 2020, and many people from Huecorio visited. Most people had not even seen these photos before, especially the ones from Crefal, and it was so interesting to listen to people's stories about the people in the photos, about the places, and remembering what they heard through their family stories. So in a way, it was also a collective exercise to reclaim our collective history and memory as a community. And the image on the left is from the radio. As a radio project, one of our main objectives is that the radio serves as a space for the participation of Purepecha women as a collective that is made up mostly of women from Black community, including myself, and where the active members of the collective right now are only women. We found necessary to also focus on issues that we face inside and outside of the community, but also on our dreams and what we envision as individual women, as members of the Radio Collective, and also as community members. And through the Radio Huecoren podcast, we have shared episodes focused on Indigenous women's rights, Indigenous women in media, the participation of Purepecha women in the New Fire ceremony, which is that interview that we were doing when we took this picture. And we're starting a new series on Purepecha women's experiences in educational spaces later this spring. The image on the left is from one of the workshops that we had already organized every summer in the community. And for about 4 years at Radio Huecoren, we have organized workshops with children. We have designed workshops also with other women in the community, but our summer activities have mostly focused on the children. And we, so our workshops take place from the beginning of June all the way to the end of July. Sometimes we also take a couple of weeks from August, and we work on different topics from radio for children, community-based photography, art, community cinema. We also have a workshop that focuses on identifying traditional plants from our territory, from the lake. And we also have a community library, and we accept donations all year round and use the material that we have for the workshops. And we've also had Purepecha language workshops in the past, with which have worked pretty well with the children, and they like coming to the workshops. And on the right is an image from just looking at some archives when I was in Michoacan, and I included this picture because consulting the archives is also important to our communities, and we can learn many things through them that can serve our community. So the archives can provide information about our communities. They contain part of our memory and can be useful also in legal cases. My community, for example, has some documents dating back to colonial times, and many more at different archives. Many more are in different archives in Michoacan and also in Mexico City. And I think that if you're an academic and you have, for example, the time, the access, the resources to consult the archives and give that information back to your community, it is also a way of reciprocating, because it may be hard for some community members to have the resources, the access, the time to, for example, go to Mexico City and look at archives where there's information that they may need. And so we're approaching the end of the presentation, and I want to talk a little bit about the Purepecha community in the US diaspora. I went to school, high school, my entire higher education journey along with my sister. We did not know any other Purepecha professors or students, and many times it was very difficult finding out, learning how to navigate the higher education system. And although the Purepecha population in the diaspora is significant, there is not really an official census that tells us exactly about where the Purepecha population is, how many speakers of the Purepecha language there are, or where we can find them. On the other hand, now, for example, there are Purepecha collectives in some parts of the US that actually do amazing work directly with Purepecha communities. Some examples that I can give you right now are Ireta Purepecha and the Proyecto Purepecha California Central. Ireta Purepecha, for example, is located in Washington State, and with the coordination of Tata Marco Antonio Floresquín, the participation of his daughters and other community members in the area, they have built an important network focused on helping the communities. And the Proyecto Purepecha California Central is another example. So they organize every year the Reencuentro Purepecha, which is a large regional cultural gathering that takes place in California. So this past year, it took place in Farmersville. And it takes place every year for all the Purepecha people living in the US diaspora. I'm also thinking about people such as Fabiola Zamora, who is a Purepecha radio host from Santa Ana, California, and she streams traditional music and songs through her Facebook page. And through this exercise of streaming Purepecha music and Pirecuas, she is transmitting Purepecha knowledge. I'm also thinking about Luz Marquez from Cheranástico, from the community of Cheranástico, who has been also sharing Purepecha musical expressions for decades, for many years in the Chicago area of Illinois. But knowledge is also shared in a transnational context. I'm also thinking about Joaquin Marquez, along with his father, Pedro Marquez Joaquin, who unfortunately passed away in the beginning of this year, who has been very proactive in Purepecha language revitalization projects and indigenous migrant rights. He and his father founded the Instituto de Enseñanza de Lenguas Originarias, which is a community-based institution that serves indigenous bilingual teachers, translators, and interpreters across the continent, in addition to providing courses in various indigenous languages, including Purepecha, and a significant student population in their courses comes from the US. And some of them are Purepechas from younger generations who have found in the language a meaningful way to reconnect with their identity. So one central aspect that I want to highlight about all these projects in the Purepecha US diaspora is a connection to the Purepecha communities at home and the support that they give them, even if they're not physically present. And I mentioned these examples a little bit more in detail because they show that there is a network of support and of knowledge happening. And I appreciate that they are here for the Purepecha community in the diaspora. So my final reflections. So why is it important to make spaces for indigenous women in our communities in academic spaces? How can we do it? Can we actually do it? Is there any hope? Indigenous women are knowledge creators, knowledge holders, knowledge transmitters. In Purepecha communities, knowledge production is produced collectively, and that includes our participation as women. And our knowledge as Purepecha takes place across spaces and across geographies, as I have mentioned through some of the examples that I gave in this presentation. It takes place within our own communities of origin, in our neighborhoods, in the towns or cities where we live, whether we work with community-based knowledge, whether we are in academic spaces, in different industries, in different fields, whether we are children, youth, adults, elders, and no matter what our sexual orientation or gender identity is, we all contribute to the collective knowledge of our communities. And that must be valued. And for those of us who are in academia, especially in the social sciences and the humanities, it is one of those spaces where we can contribute to our communities, and our contributions should also be valued. So some months ago, for a class that I taught, we read We Are Dancing For You, which is a book written by Dr. Katja Rizzo-Baldi, who is a fellow PhD graduate from the MS program at UC Davis. In her text, she mentions the importance of rewriting our stories as Indigenous women and rewriting also our memories. So in higher education, we're constantly writing. Through our writing, we are reclaiming our stories, our identities, our memories as Indigenous women. So in that sense, through our writing, what we write about, how we write, as Indigenous women in academia, we're also resisting. We're also creating knowledge and transmitting it. So my final conclusion as I wrap up today's event, today's presentation, I think that more than a final conclusion, I'm going to mention some questions. Why is it important to talk about Indigenous women in academia? What can we do as academic institutions and as people within these institutions to make sure that Indigenous women's voices are heard, and then when we talk about an issue that concerns Indigenous women and their communities, that it is their experiences and our experiences that we listen to. So my final reflection for today is that we must listen to the voices of Indigenous women. So I want to thank you again for being here, and also thank you so much to Andrea, Deli, Victoria for organizing this event, for reaching out to me, and because it is so necessary to put our voices out there. So thank you so much for for doing that through this event. So I look forward to also listening to Andrea's experiences, and if you have a question or a comment, I would be happy to also answer.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Gutierrez. There are many aspects of your academic trajectory that I identify with. Feeling of loneliness and perhaps nobody really understanding you, and a little bit of imposter syndrome as well, especially when doing research. And I'm still thinking about too, like your reflection questions, like what knowledge am I bringing to campus, and who or what is a part of my identity too. And I think a big part, at least for myself, when coming onto campus too, is showing up in my rebosos, with my aretes, with the embroidered shirts. That for me is like my emotional support, right? Showing up saying, this is who I am. And that's not something we see a lot around here as well. I think my question for you is, how did you find that emotional support as an undergrad? Because I know you said you didn't like find any other Indigenous students, so that is something that I struggled with as well. So aside from family, where did you get that support?
Thank you for your question. I totally relate. So I started my undergrad in 2006. I was mentioning in the presentation that I was at ARC for about 2 years before transferring to UC Davis. So when I was in community college, so that network of support, I think I found it in other students, even though they were not necessarily Indigenous students or Purepecha students. For example, through the Puente program, we were able to share a lot of experiences that I think that if I had not been part of the program, I wouldn't have, been able to meet other students, because at the time I was so focused on taking my classes, but also working to be able to pay for my books, for my classes. So there was not a lot of time left. But I think that being part of the program really allowed me to have the time to connect with other people, with other students. And I think also my professors in community college, that was the first time that I had an Indigenous professor. So just listening to him, to his experience, a different kind of understanding also, I think came from him. I remember it was an English course that he taught, but then I started also taking other classes. And when I transferred to UC Davis, I was also able to meet other Indigenous professors. And yes, I didn't know other in Purepecha professors or students in higher education. I'm sure there were, but I just, I didn't know them, at least not in my area, in the area where I live. But I think one of the highlights of my experience was that I went to school with my sister. So we were alone. At the same time, we were not, because we shared a lot of experiences. We always talked to each other. So I think that helped us a lot. And also, I think not necessarily within the institution, but outside of it, is being connected with our community, because even though because of school and other issues, we were not able to go back that often to the community. Just knowing that the community was there and that we were part of it, and that we had a connection to our family, I think that was also part of the support. And also, as the years, I did my undergrad and my PhD in the same institution. So I think that also allowed me to build longer term relationships with the people there. So by the time that I got to my PhD, I already knew a little bit more some of the professors, some of the students. One interesting thing is that when I started my PhD, one of my fellow classmates from community college, and a native Californian student also started in the same program as my sister and I. So it was so, I think, in a way, rewarding to see that all of us, like the three of us, came from the same neighborhood. We were Indigenous students. We met in community college. We started our PhD program and we graduated at the same time. So having that network of support, those experiences, even though we had some time where we didn't see each other before starting the PhD, I think just knowing that helped me to navigate that. And now I think as an early career scholar, as I'm starting also my career after the PhD, that is something that I want to provide my students, and also other colleagues as well. Just having that support and that network to share experiences.
Thank you. And you mentioned too not being able to go back to Mexico to your community all the time. So at least for myself, I find that it's a struggle too, because I'm still in school, and with the quarter system, it's sometimes it's not possible. So I am in communication with the community here in Santana. And I would say that language is so important when trying to connect with the community. And I myself do not speak Purepecha. I know a few words, but I feel like that is like the one thing that's missing for me to further connect. So how do you suggest one goes about it for either if you are Purepecha or someone that's just trying to connect further into the Indigenous communities?
Thank you for that question. I think we also, regarding that, we share a similar experience, because I was mentioning in the presentation that I come from a community where the language is longer spoken. So it was in one of the last studies about the community in the 1960s, only 11% of the community spoke the language. At this point, nobody does. We don't have fluent speakers, so sometimes it's very difficult. So I started with my Purepecha language learning process back when I started my PhD. So I took some language classes, but then I think that one of the best ways to reconnect is through the language, because the language as a system, it contains an entire worldview. So for native speakers, the language gives them or gives them a different view of the world that we perhaps don't have anymore, or that we don't understand, at the same level. But I think reconnecting through the language is so important, because that gives you an opportunity to talk to people, to understand them a lot more. So I think when in the past years, especially with the rise of the use of technology, there are many places, many courses where you can find those resources. One of the examples that I was mentioning in the presentation is the Instituto de Enseñanza de Lenguas Originarias, which offers online courses. So what they're implementing right now, for example, is a system where students get where you don't go to, for example, to a class and you look at grammar textbooks or write, but you also connect with native speakers from the communities. So I think that also provides students a way to engage with people, with the speakers of the language, with people who live in the communities. And I totally understand that being away from the community with all the commitments that students have, or that just in general, even if people are not in academic spaces, you're working, you're doing many things. So sometimes that you don't have like a lot of time at your disposal. So I think that having these resources is so valuable, so that everybody can do it. And I was also mentioning that in the courses that the Instituto provides, many of the students that they have are younger people, younger generations in the US who are reconnecting to their Purepecha identity. So I definitely encourage everybody who would like to, take a class, to engage or to talk to native speakers, to consider the language classes. The Instituto is just one example, but there are many, many other places.
Thank you. I will definitely look into that because I do feel that disconnect, right, that there is. But now kind of going back to share about my academic experience. So I'm not sure if I had shared with you previously, but I grew up in Orange County and my parents are from Arantepacua. I don't know if you've heard of it. And so they came here pretty young, and growing up in Orange County, I didn't even know I was Purepecha. I went to dominantly white schools my entire life. And then come like community college, I start questioning like, okay, well, who am I really? Because I'm just surrounded by all these white walls and I can't really identify with anyone around me. They don't understand the rules my parents have for me. I have to ask to go out. I have to be home by a certain time. And I kind of started asking my family, okay, like, where are we from? Who are these people? My parents would occasionally speak Purepecha in the house and be like, what are you saying? And I think because of where I grew up, I guess like ashamed because I was like, well, nobody else looks like me. Nobody else comes from a place like my family. So I always thought it was something that I had to hide. And I think as I got older, I was looking for more of my sense of belonging too. And luckily, I got to really immerse myself in the culture by beginning to visit my grandparents and also through a program I was in where I got to volunteer in Michoacan. I was on Pacanda for like about 2 weeks there with the community. We were volunteering and visiting organizations too, that like Beef, I think it's called. And I think coming back to the US, I was like, hold up. I think I found my passion. I think I'm starting to develop who I am as a person, and also being the only Purepecha person in that program to kind of gave me like this, like the setting stone to be like, okay, well, this is what we should do, or this is, like introducing them into the culture too, which was another experience that I didn't know I was gonna have to, or a role that I had to take on that I wasn't even assigned. So when I came back to the US, I was like, I don't want to do nursing anymore. I want to do international studies. I want to learn more about Mexico, policymaking, my community, and the community like back in California, what can be done, or the transborder relations too, and also coming into UCI and coming into every space being like, oh, hello, Professor so-and-so. This is who I am. This is how I identify. Let me share my story with you, or how can you support me too? And so when I look back at that, I'm like, I would have never assumed that I would be here representing my community, or at least attempting to. So yeah, everything that you shared with us today, I completely relate to. And also, I think something that I struggle with the most is, well, I was born in California. I don't speak the language. I have lived within the community for no more than 3 months at a time. So who am I to be sharing their story? Who am I to speak for us, right? So that is also something that I occasionally struggle with, because I'm like, okay, well, am I really the one to represent us in these spaces too. So I don't know if that's something that you struggled with as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story, and I totally agree, and I think that a lot of the things that we go through in not only in higher education but in education as a whole has to do with the historical experiences of Indigenous peoples with official education. When I was working on my dissertation research in my community, I was doing interviews, and some of the interviews focused on people's experience in the school system, especially in the elementary schools that we have in the community. And some of the stories that people shared have to do with discrimination and with racism that they experienced um, from other students, especially because the school not only received students from the community, but also from other, nearby places. So for example, there is a community, an island close to where I live that is called Uranden. And for example, people from Uranden shared that they often, the other students who were not Purepecha, also students who did not speak Purepecha would beat them up because they would speak their language or would dress in their traditional clothing in the school. So that is part also of the to the experiences of the women of Cheran, as an example. But I can definitely speak about my experience. And I think that sharing our experiences is very meaningful because in a way, I think it also allows us to build networks and to, as I was mentioning in the beginning, when I was starting school, I didn't know other people. I would have liked someone to share their, I don't know, experience with me, and feeling perhaps displaced or feeling that you don't belong. So in a way that would have helped me, um, see that perhaps that is not the case, that I do belong and that my voice in whatever space that I am, including academia, is important. So I know that we sometimes struggle with with sharing our stories because we think that it's not valuable enough, that it's not authentic enough, that it's not what other people expect. But I think that our experiences speak to those, to not only to ourselves but also to our families and to the communities where those struggles that we face originate from. So I definitely encourage all of you to think about, those stories, those family stories, those community stories that you bring with you. And I was mentioning before also about the knowledge that you bring with you, because sometimes in academic spaces, we think it's, as a system, as an academic system, we think that being in a classroom is the only way of creating knowledge and reproducing knowledge. And what I do, for example, in the past in my classes is that in the beginning we do an exercise where I ask the students to just do a little bit of research about the place where they're from, where they live, to identify the indigenous populations that are from that area. Uh, Most of the students that I've had in the past are actually indigenous students, so they go back and do a little bit of research about their own communities. So then relate that back to, to what we're covering in class. For example, in a Native American Studies class, we talk about land, we talk about history. So we connect, those two, the research that they do about their communities and where they come from, and what we are talking about in relation to land struggles and history. And what I want my students to know is that the knowledge that comes with them, and also their voices, is important in this space. And as I mentioned, our stories are unique, but they represent who we are. So we cannot really leave that aside.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. If anybody has any questions they would like to ask Dr. Gutierrez, feel free to speak up or type it in the chat.
I have a question, but it's more of a technical question. Is that event or the talk going to be shared? I mean, the recording?
Yes, it will be shared. We'll post it on our website, and then we can also send it to you once we get the final link, so that you can also share it if you'd like.
Yeah, I have some people that were asking me, but who put it here, so I was just wanted to make sure if it was going to be shared somewhere. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Gutierrez, thank you so much for everything you shared. A lot of kind of the experiences that you had also reminded me of something that El Centro Cultural de Mexico here in Santana does, is they also have a radio station with the community, having different talk shows and talking about a lot of what's happening in Santana, but I think also bringing to light things that are happening in their communities at home in Mexico. So it reminded me of that. And actually, that was one of my questions to you. Do you mind if I share this recording with El Centro? Because I think that your story might be something that they would want to share through their channels as well, and invite you there. So I wanted to pose that opportunity possibly for that as well. Yeah,
it would be great. Thank you. Yeah, and I was just answering the question from Valentina about the program for Purépecha, for the Purépecha language. So it's called the Instituto de Enseñanza de Lenguas Originarias. But there are also other programs, but this is one that they specifically only have like online courses. But a search also on the internet is gonna bring up some more places, teachers, and so on.
Dr. Gutierrez, I know you're in Sacramento, but maybe you've heard of the trueque that's happening here in Santana in April. Do you have any plans to attend?
I would like to attend, maybe not this time, but I would like to attend for sure. I've seen that there are Purépecha folks in Santana who always share a lot of stuff going on. So it would be great to be there at some point. Yeah, I would love to. Oh, and Valentina also asked when is it happening?
It's April 10th at the Centro Cultural in Santana. Yeah, if Valentina, if you have any questions or anybody on here that would like to attend, feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to share this experience with you. It's really fun. There's a lot of indigenous music, the food is the best part. And we all dress up in our traditional attire, and it's open to the public, so anybody can attend. I really recommend it for anyone that is looking to get, try to connect to the Indigenous community and learn more about us. But with that being said, thank you so much, Dr. Gutierrez, for sharing the space with us today. We appreciate you and all of your work, and we look forward to seeing what else you do in the future. And thank you to everybody else for joining us today.
Thank you.